Matt Lutz. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, what is moral error theory?
Moral error theory is a view in metaethics about the nature of moral language and moral discourse. It is typically described, I like to describe it as a conjunction of two other theories. One is cognitivism about moral thought and language. And cognitivism about moral thought and language means that when we are using moral language or thinking moral thoughts, we are thinking about morality. So for instance, if I say something like giving to charity is good, then the role that the word good plays in that sentence of giving to charity is good, the role that word good plays is to refer to some property of goodness. We're saying of giving to charity that it has the property of being good. This is opposed to views like expressivism, which say that when I'm using the word good, I'm not describing goodness in any sense. I am instead sort of like expressing an attitude that I have, just letting you know how I feel about it. But no, according to cognitivism, we are describing things as being good when we use the word good. And then there's a metaphysical claim. So the first claim is a conceptual claim, and it's saying that when we are using the word good, we're describing things as being good. We're using the word wrong, we're describing things as being wrong, and so on and so forth for all moral language. And then a metaphysical claim, which says that there is no property of rightness or wrongness. So the person who coined the term error theory, the Australian philosopher J.L. Mackie, the first sentence of his book where he lays out the error theory is, there are no objective values. So maybe that's like the simpler way to explain the error theory before I get into all this stuff about conjunction of two different theses, right? But there are no objective values. I guess that's the simplest way to state the thesis. And then like the significance of that is to say, when we talk about morality in many everyday circumstances, we talk as though there were objective values, and yet there are no objective values, and that's why moral thought and language is systematically in error, because we are attempting to describe a reality that doesn't exist. And so maybe the easiest kind of like sort of analogy for understanding what error theory is all about is error theory is like atheism in metaethics, right? So what an atheist would say is that when normal people use the word God, they're not trying to talk about like love in the universe or something like that. They're trying to talk about God, right? But there is no God. So religious discourse, theistic discourse, which generally entails or presupposes the existence of a God, is systematically in error because there's no God out there to make our assertions about God end up being true.
How do we argue against non-cognitivism? So I take it that the central claim of cognitivism is that moral claims like it is good to love your neighbor, it's wrong to be hateful, you shouldn't torture people, those are capable of being true or false. That's like the core cognitivist claim, that these are claims about the world that have content. They're capable of being true or false. And that contrasts with non-cognitivist views like emotivism, which is the idea that moral claims are actually just at their foundation expressions of emotion. Like murder is bad is just boo, murder. And that kind of an utterance is not capable of being true or false. So why shouldn't we be
things can get much more complicated than that on the non-cognitive side of things, but that's sort of like the simplest kind of 101 version of the theory.
Right. So so why shouldn't we be non-cognitivists? What's wrong with that thesis?
Well, there are a couple of issues here. I mean, so there's so we can start with the dumbest argument, which even though it's a dumb argument, I mean, there's something compelling about it, which is that just doesn't seem like what we're doing, right? When we say things like murder is bad, we're talking about murder being bad, right? I mean, I don't like murder. I'm strongly opposed to murder, right? But you know, when I say things like murder is bad, I'm not just letting you know how I feel about it. I'm trying to describe it as being a certain way. So cognitivism is sort of like the easy sort of read of the surface grammar, right? So like when you get the simple sort of emotivist view where it's like, you know, boo murder, right? Boo murder clearly is a way of expressing an emotion, right? You're using this word boo, which is like an emotion expressing word, and there's no is copula in there, right? We're not saying murder is boo, right? The role that is plays in a sentence like that is to ascribe a property, right? The table is brown, right? It says the table has the property of being brown, right? Murder is bad or murder is wrong says that murder has the property of being, right? So there's a very sort of simple, it's just like the obvious surface grammar. Now, the people who are fans of emotivism or other versions of expressivism will say, whoa, hold on, right? The surface grammar is one thing, but let's not read too much into the surface grammar, right? If you do sort of a deeper logical analysis, you'll be able to see that despite the surface grammar, really what's going on is something more expressive. And whether or not that is an acceptable answer kind of depends on sort of what further things they have to say about what the underlying meaning of the sentence really is. And different non-cognitivists say different things, and it gets rather complicated. I guess we can get into particular versions of non-cognitivism if you're interested. But the second major argument against non-cognitivism is something known as the Frege-Geach problem. And the Frege-Geach problem is a really hard problem to explain because it gets like super into the weeds of formal semantics. But the basic idea behind the Frege-Geach problem says that it's not just about the surface grammar, like when we use moral language, it looks like we're describing reality, but also moral language works in certain ways that kind of we can only make sense of if moral language is trying to describe reality. So a standard example that gets used to illustrate the Frege-Geach problem is the example of just a basic modus ponens argument with a conditional claim and then an inference accordingly. So something like if it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to get your little brother to steal. It's wrong to steal, therefore it's wrong to get your little brother to steal. Now that seems like a perfectly good argument, formally speaking at least, logically, right? Maybe we might try to dispute one or other of the premises for whatever reason, but logically that seems like a good argument. And then compare that to something like, if boo the Yankees, then boo the Mets. Boo the Yankees, therefore boo the Mets, right? That doesn't look like a good argument. That sounds weird. That sounds like something has gone wrong. And it's not just an issue of like, again, the surface grammar doesn't really make sense. But it's not clear what that conditional claim is even supposed to mean, right? So think about if boo the Yankees, then boo the Mets, right? Like what's a conditional even supposed to mean? That's not clear, right? In a sort of normal account of conditionals, it's supposed to state some sort of a truth functional relation between the two claims, right? If the antecedent of the conditional is true, then the consequent of the conditional is true. That's why it can feature in a sort of modus ponens arguments like that, right? If the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true. The truth of the antecedent guarantees the truth of the consequent. Premise 2, the antecedent is true, therefore, conclusion, the consequent is true as well. But you can't do that if you're a non-cognitivist, right? Because what is that, right? If boo the Yankees, then boo the Mets supposed to mean, right? Like, not only grammatically does that not make sense, but logically it doesn't make sense, right? The truth of boo the Yankees guarantees the truth of boo the Mets. like, that again sounds like a really weird thing to say, and it sounds weird in large part because "boo the Yankees" isn't the kind of thing that can be true or false, right? It doesn't represent the Yankees as being any particular way. It's just an expression of an emotion. So what all of this is supposed to show is not just at a surface grammatical level, but at a sort of deeper semantic logical level, the way that moral language works is that it represents the world as being a certain way, and therefore expresses propositions which are capable of being true or false. Because if moral language doesn't describe the world as being a certain way, and doesn't express moral propositions that are capable of being true or false, then we can't really do logic with moral language. The same way that we can't do logic with "boo the Yankees, boo the Mets." But we can do logic with moral language. We do logic with moral language all of the time. And so if non-cognitivism is correct, if some version of expressivism or non-cognitivism is correct, then you can't do the logic with morality that we can clearly do. So that's maybe the deeper problem for non-cognitivist theories of moral language.
Let me get your thoughts on a problem I have with this whole conversation about non-cognitivism, whatever the view might be. It seems like they're making a very bold claim about how people do in fact use moral language, like what moral terms generally mean in moral discourse among people. They're not making the claim of like how we ought to construe moral terms and moral language. They're saying this is how we do in fact do it. And that makes their position more tractable, more open to straight up empirical investigation. And I wonder, like, if we were able to do sound statistical analysis on a wide range of psychological and sociological data to draw out inferences about how most people engage in moral language and what most people think about their moral discourse. That's doable in principle. And what if we found after that survey of the data that most people, the vast majority of people, they mean these in a contentful way. They mean moral claims in the more intuitive way of making claims about moral properties and so on. Like, would the non-cognitivist admit defeat at that point? Would they say, all right, most people don't mean it the way we're construing it, so we're wrong? I almost feel like they wouldn't do that, and so maybe there's something deeper than a merely descriptive claim going on here? Or am I mistaken?
You are, I think, mistaken, although explaining why is maybe a bit complicated.
That's okay, I'm here for it.
Yeah. Great. So you're correct that they're making a descriptive claim. That is the view. It is a descriptive view. You suggest that maybe they're doing something a bit more. I don't know. Maybe you can find a non-cognitivist out there who would admit to doing something a bit more, but that's not the standard sort of view. Now, you suggested that they are maybe aiming for something more, because if it's simply a descriptive view, it's amenable to empirical refutation. And that's not clear at all.
Okay.
Because there is a, sort of kind of long-standing difficulty within the philosophy of language about the extent to which semantic meaning is empirically knowable. So we can talk to people, we can ask people, right? We can say, what are you intending to do with your language?
Right. And
they might tell us things. But maybe people are mistaken, right? People can be mistaken about the meanings of their words, right? To understand the meanings of the words, you need to be, reflective in certain ways, have a certain understanding of what's conventional within the community and what's going on in your head and how language works. And like, formal semantics is extremely complicated. And so what you would be exposing with that sort of empirical study of asking people how are you using moral language is just whether or not common sense tells us that we are non-cognitivists. And I think if you do that survey, what you would find is that common sense tells us that we are not non-cognitivists, right? That's contrary to common sense. In fact, that was the first argument that I gave against non-cognitivism. It looks like it's contrary to common sense. But of course, what the non-cognitivists are going to say is that if you really understand semantics and how that works, then you will see that blah, 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 right? And so then you get involved in a harder set of questions, which is, well, how do you know what the semantics of moral terms really is? And of course, that's going to be partly empirical, maybe entirely empirical, but maybe partly a priori, maybe entirely a priori. This is a huge debate within the philosophy of language about how to understand sort of like what sort of evidence we could have for different semantic theories. So maybe you're right that this is entirely empirical and could be settled by an appropriate sort of psychological, sociological, linguistic study.
Right.
But that's going to involve taking on some very controversial commitments about metaphilosophy and the philosophy of language.
Okay, I see what you mean. Still, I feel like if you surveyed people and gave them sufficient philosophical grounding prior to the survey, this is all purely hypothetical and probably not doable in practice. But if you did that with 10,000 randomly selected people so that you would get a good statistic inference from the people you're speaking to the whole population, I feel like cognitivism would come out looking pretty good. And in order to rescue non-cognitivism as a true descriptive claim of people in general, you'd have to engage in some pretty ad hoc maneuvers to say that, well, these people didn't really understand what they were saying. The really intended meaning is kind of hidden behind layers of inscrutable semantic intention. They're mistaken. They're not aware of what they're saying. We have to look at the whole context. That's going to strike me anyway. It's just ad hoc. Like, really, you're saving your view from falsification by claiming hidden intention, it would seem. It's going to be more subtle than that, I agree. But do you have some sympathy with my reaction here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not a non-cognitivist, right? There's a reason why I'm not a non-cognitivist. I'm trying to do the view suitable justice, just in case there's any non-cognitivists in their audience. And even if there's not non-cognitivists in the audience, people should understand what the view is and how people they're going to respond. But ultimately, yeah, I'm not a non-cognitivist. And the most sophisticated arguments against non-cognitivism are these arguments having to do with what I call the Frege-Geach problem, having to do with the logical structure. I gave a very kind of surface level understanding of what that's all supposed to be about. I find the Frege-Geach problem compelling, but I admit that I don't find it compelling because I am a super expert in philosophical logic, and I've pursued all the different ways that this can be developed and found that they're all failures. I just think that all the attempts that I've seen to try to make this work just feel really ad hoc and undermotivated. And so it just feels like a dumb, bad research project to me, right? With all due respect to the non-cognitivists out there, whenever I read, a paper written on, non-cognitive semantics, I'm like, oh God, it just doesn't work. Nice try. I see where you're coming from. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and given that plausible fact that things just get more and more ad hoc, complex, as you engage in the dialectic, that the maneuvers you need to engage in order to make non-cognitivism viable, what is the motivation for the view in the first place? Why are these sophisticated philosophers defending the view when it does, from the surface, from the outside anyway, look pretty convoluted? Why not just go with the easiest commonsensical route? What's driving them? That's always been my question. Why?
There's basically two motivations for non-cognitivism. So one motivation, which is a bit more traditional, goes back to like the logical positivists a century ago or something like that. These were maybe the first ones to really develop a non-cognitivist view as a sophisticated research program.
Right.
Is just because they are positivists. They are hardcore empiricists. They're very strict empiricists about what they will allow into their metaphysics, right, and about how their epistemology is supposed to work. And morality looks weird. It looks like weird metaphysics, right? Like, what is the property of goodness even supposed to be? How can we know about it? Doesn't seem like we can study this kind of thing scientifically, empirically, but for the positivists, the only thing you're allowed to have into your ontology, the only thing that you're allowed to admit exists is things that you can study more or less directly empirically. So morality doesn't fit. Now, what the positivists generally wanted to say is if you don't have something strictly empirical, then it's meaningless. It's just sort of like bullshit. But they didn't want to say that morality was bullshit because they kind of had a certain amount of respect for morality. And so non-cognitivism was like the fallback position in some ways, a way to explain how moral language could be meaningful in a sense without being epistemologically and metaphysically respectable according to their very strict criteria of what makes something epistemologically and metaphysically respectable. So that's one sort of motivation for non-cognitivist theories. Another motivation for non-cognitivist theories, which is much more popular today, points out the practical nature of moral language and moral thought. So the idea here is that if you have moral beliefs, then moral beliefs, or maybe moral commitments or moral judgments, I could say a bit more neutrally, they're the kinds of things that can motivate you to act in certain ways, and that we expect to motivate you to act in certain ways. So another common example here, you're debating the ethics of giving to charity, giving to Oxfam or whatever, right? Reading Peter Singer talking about young children drowning in shallow pools, and in the end of the conversation, the person that you're having the conversation with convinces you that you should be giving to charity, right? And you say, yes, okay, I admit, I ought morally to give to charity. That is an obligation that I have. And then just as you say that, there's a knock on the door, and it's someone from Oxfam. They're holding out the hat, and they say, would you give me some money, right? What are you going to do? Probably going to give them money. And if you don't give them money, you go, nah, I prefer not to, and then slam the door in their face. You're going to turn around to your friend, and your friend's going to be like, you don't really think that you're morally obligated to give to Oxfam, right? If you did really think that, you would have given, but you didn't give, so I didn't really convince you that you're morally obligated to give to Oxfam, right? So moral judgments involve a kind of practical commitment, is the lesson we're supposed to take from that case. And if moral judgments involve a kind of practical commitment, then they need to be a kind of practically committed mental state. But mere beliefs about the way the world is, about the distribution of properties throughout the world, aren't practically committed mental states. You need something else going on there, a kind of desire or a kind of intention or a plan or something like that in order to actually generate action. So the mental state expressed by a moral utterance, right, the moral judgment that we make, which is then expressed by a moral utterance, needs to be a desire or a plan or an intention or something like that, because if it wasn't a desire or plan, intention, something like that, then it wouldn't be able to practically motivate us, which moral judgments can do. So that's the motivation argument for non-cognitivism, which is much more popular today.
Yeah. I mean that has some plausibility going for it. I mean, in the interest of zeroing in on error theory specifically, I'll push us to the next set of distinctions. So we have this distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. And then once we land in the cognitivist camp, you might either be an ethical naturalist or an ethical non-naturalist. Can you fill us in on what this subset of distinctions refers to?
Sure. Actually, but before we get into that, I should back up half a step to another set of distinctions here, because sure. I accidentally elided this in my initial discussion of what error theory is, but I should bring it up here now.
Sure.
Right. So there's another group of theories which are called subjectivist or constructivist, or maybe just non-objectivist. And non-objectivist theories, what they're going to say is that there are moral facts, they're just subjective facts, right?
Yes.
So if you say something like, again, killing is wrong, giving to charity is good, whatever, then you are describing a moral fact, but the moral fact is not an objective fact. And then there's a standard set of objections to that. And the standard objections to those sorts of views are, again, sort of like common sense that doesn't look like what we're doing. Now, sort of people who are not professional philosophers will push back. They say, no, morality is relative, right? Morality is relative.
Right.
Well, sort of like empirically morality is relative, like people engage in moral disagreements, but the simple fact of a moral disagreement doesn't show that there's no fact of the matter, right? If I say 2 + 2 = 4, and you say 2 + 2 = 37, that doesn't mean there's no fact of the matter about what 2 + 2 = 4 is. I'm right and you're wrong, right? So similarly, so we could say then, like there's a very stupid argument to say we need to be a relativist about math because I think 2 + 2 = 4 and you think 2 + 2 = 37, but no, that doesn't follow at all, right? Because I'm right and you're wrong. So similarly, in the moral case, there are moral disagreements, but the fact of moral disagreements does not imply relativism, right? Again, it does in a descriptive sense. We do disagree, but not in the sense that like there is a subjective fact of the matter. And sort of the main objection to any sort of subjectivist theory actually has to do with disagreement, because it's sort of a common sense bit of our understanding of morality that we do disagree, right? If I say, you ought to give to charity, and you say, no, it's not the case that I ought to give to charity, right? Maybe it's a good thing to do, but I don't have to do it, right? We can have a moral disagreement here, right? But if moral facts are all subjective, then it's hard to explain how we could even be disagreeing. If I'm saying, like, we need to give to charity, and that is a fact, but the fact that it is, that's a subjective fact. I'm just sort of describing something about my own moral system. And you're saying, no, we don't need to give to charity. It's a nice thing to do, but we're not obligated to give to charity. That is a fact about my own moral system. Well, then I'm just describing my moral system, and you're just describing your moral system, and we're both right. We're both right in our descriptions of our own moral systems. So where's the disagreement, right? It's like if I say, it's raining where I am here, and you say, it's not raining where I am here, right? Well, then we just describe the difference in the weather between the two places where we are. And it would be stupid for us to like engage in a disagreement about whether or not it's really raining. No, it's raining here, but it's not raining there, right? Similarly, if a kind of relativism was correct about morality, it would be stupid to engage in moral disagreement because, well, it's, the action is correct according to my system, but not correct according to your system, so we're done. But it's not stupid to engage in moral disagreement. We engage in moral disagreement all the time. It's like a really important part of how we act and interact morally. So that shows that the subjective theories are missing something.
Now, just to clarify, like a subjectivist, do they assert that moral claims are true or false? But when I say like murder is bad, what that means is, what that claim is I don't like murder. And that can be true or false, but it's a subjective fact in that it's a description of the subject speaking, of me, myself, and my preferences. It doesn't make a claim about the objective world, it makes a claim about me. I don't like murder. Is that the basic subjectivist position?
That is the simplest subjectivist position. I mean, it's not just about you, it's about a relationship between you and the thing, so you're kind of talking about you and kind of talking about the thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if it's a subjective fact, then that the nature of that subjective fact is going to have to, in one way or another, sort of like involve the individual or the culture or the normative system or whatever you want to talk about, relative to which that fact is true, right? So that gets involved either at the semantic level or as a kind of presupposition, or, of course there's lots of weird complicated theories here, right? But the basic objection to any such view is that it's going to have difficulties accounting for the nature and possibility of disagreement, because we're always going to be dealing with just distinct facts, right? One set of facts is about one system, the other set of facts is about the other system, and so how are they actually butting heads?
Right.
And the only way to make sense of that then is to be an objectivist, to say no, there is one common subject matter that we're talking about, the morality of the action, and we're disputing that thing, which is the objective moral fact.
Yes. Now, subjectivism, is that a form of what we will soon define as ethical naturalism? It is a form of cognitivism, but it's a naturalist kind of cognitivism?
Typically. So when people talk about moral naturalism, they're usually talking about like a realist or objectivist kind of naturalism. That term moral naturalism is usually used to refer to that. But it's true that for the people who like subjectivism, there's not that many people who like subjectivism. But the people that do like that view are motivated by a sort of general methodological naturalism, right? So, like I said, the first motivation for non-cognitivism comes from the positivist era, where they were all, positivists. But we might think of that as being a sort of broadly naturalistic kind of approach to philosophy, right? It's all about science and what science tells us. And if science doesn't tell us about it, then it's weird and bad and we hate it. And so that sort of motivation is at least lurking in the background for almost all moral theories except for non-naturalist realism, which we'll come to shortly. But so yes, that is going to be part of the motivation for a subjectivist view. And also for a lot of non-cognitivists, also for error theorists, like lots of different views want to try to take that sort of underlying naturalism very seriously.
Okay. And so then what is this distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism, between cognitivists?
Nobody can agree on that. It's a really awful state of affairs where everybody uses these terms of naturalism and non-naturalism, but nobody really agrees what that distinction amounts to. I guess I can try to give you the vibe of it, which is that the naturalist thinks that there are moral facts, and those moral facts are natural facts, whereas the non-naturalist thinks that there are moral facts, and those moral facts are not natural facts. Now, what is a natural fact? Nobody knows. But again, kind of get in the vibe of it. It's a sciencey thing, the modern scientific worldview, the sorts of things that science does or could or would, if it were done correctly, tell us about. Those are the natural things. And then the non-natural things, that's everything else.
So, Eric Wielenberg and Michael Huemer both generally agreed on a certain way of drawing this distinction and defining those terms. And so what they explained to me, and I want to hear if you think this maps onto general usage, is that the naturalist thinks that moral terms are fundamentally descriptive facts, that you can reduce moral claims to purely descriptive facts. And so I often think about Sam Harris's view in his book, The Moral Landscape, that like claims about morality are just claims about what is most conducive to human flourishing. And claims about what is most conducive to human flourishing, that's a purely descriptive fact about what is the case. It's open to scientific investigation. We can, in principle, figure it out through just studies in biology and psychology, sociology, and understanding how we are happiest. Whereas the non-naturalist says, no, moral claims are fundamentally evaluative. They are fundamentally and irreducibly about what ought to be the case. Not about what is the case, but about what ought to be the case, what is good and bad, right and wrong. And those are irreducible. You can't break them down into more fundamental descriptive claims. I at least understand the distinction, I think, between fundamental descriptive and fundamental evaluative facts. And they then make the general claim that's the distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism. Is that
Right.
like more or less right? What do you think?
I think that that's confused on multiple levels.
Okay.
Although
Good.
the confusion that you're throwing out there is not unique to you. This is a minefield of misunderstandings and misapprehensions. In my own work, like I've got the SEP article on moral naturalism, so I try to do some work there and try to like explaining what all these confusions are about. It's annoying. So let's identify one particular issue here, which is that you talked about a difference between descriptive and evaluative, and you're using this word claim, descriptive claims versus evaluative claims. All right, but this isn't a distinction in language, right? It's a distinction in metaphysics about the. It's not a distinction in language. It's not a. It's a distinction about the kinds of things that exist. Right. So a naturalist is going to say, like, yeah, when I'm talking about goodness, I'm going to be using the word good. That's evaluative language, obviously. Right. So it's not a distinction in terms of language. It's a distinction in terms of what sorts of things exist. And the problem with appealing to descriptive is that is a linguistic term. I mean, well, you can use terms however you want. Language is conventional, and there's lots of different conventions floating around out there. But usually when people say the word descriptive, they mean something about language, right? There's a certain set of terms which are descriptive terms, and then there's another set of terms which are normative or evaluative terms. And what we are interested in is the descriptive terms, or the normative or evaluative terms. Now, if you want to draw the distinction that way, thinking at the level of language, then there is a way of trying to draw the distinction, which says that the naturalist believes that we can refer to moral properties using descriptive language, whereas the non-naturalist thinks that we can't, right? That our only terms that we have for referring to moral properties are evaluative terms.
Right.
Now, that is, again, historically a very common way of drawing the distinction, but it's also bananas. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because this is a distinction at the level of language when we're trying to capture some distinction at the level of metaphysics. So here's something that a naturalist might say. A naturalist might say, look, whether or not we have any descriptive terms, and then we get into this whole other question of what is a descriptive term even, right? And here again, we're just going off vibes, right? It's got a science-y, description-y vibe to it as opposed to a evaluative-y vibe to it. But okay, fine, right? Let's imagine that we can draw this distinction between descriptive and evaluative terminology. Whether or not there is any descriptive terminology which refers to a moral property is a contingent feature of our language, right? Imagine that there are descriptive terms in our language that refer to moral properties. We could imagine a slightly modified version of our language, right? Which just cuts out whatever terms that we're using to refer to those moral properties, but is in all other ways the same. That slightly more impoverished version of our language would then not have any descriptive terms that refer to moral properties. And so if our actual language contains descriptive terms that refer to moral properties, so naturalism is true, but if we had a different language, then naturalism would not be true because we wouldn't have those descriptive terms that refer to moral properties. So whether or not naturalism is true isn't about the nature of moral facts or moral properties. It's about whether the expressive power of the descriptive terms in our language, which is a highly contingent matter. Now, if you want to say that that's what I mean by the naturalism non-naturalism debate, by naturalism I mean a view about the descriptive power or say the expressive power of the descriptive terms in our language, which is a highly contingent matter, then you could use your term naturalism that way. But that seems bananas. That's not like what people are trying to talk about at all. And yet, like, that is sort of where common definitions of terms, like what you were just saying, when you were trying to draw the distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism, that's where those definitions take you. So, what many naturalists are going to say, there's a distinction that I like between one-term naturalism and two-term naturalism. And two-term naturalism is the view that there are two terms that refer to moral properties. So the moral property of goodness is referred to by the word good, and it's also referred to by some descriptive term or, a large descriptive phrase. One-term naturalism, on the other hand, is the view that there's one and only one term that refers to goodness, and that term is good. But if we say that there's one and only one term that refers to goodness, then that doesn't by itself imply that non-naturalism is true, because the property of goodness that we're referring to might be a natural property of the kind that science, broadly construed, could tell us about. And we have a natural kind term which refers to that natural kind of goodness, and that natural kind term is the word good. So it's not about the expressive power of our language. It's not about whether or not we can use descriptive language to refer to moral properties. Let me put the same point in one more way. So a common but bad objection to naturalism is to say, oh, so you say that goodness is a natural property. Well, what natural property is it? That is a bad objection. And the reason why it's a bad objection, because the answer might just be good, right? Goodness is a natural property. What natural property is goodness? Good, which is a natural property. It is identical to itself, and the property that it is a natural property. That's what it is. If you're asking me what a natural property is identical to, what you're really asking for is you're asking for a descriptive phrase that I can also use to refer to the natural property of goodness. But it is not part of the view of moral naturalism that such a descriptive phrase exists, because it's not a view about the expressive power of the descriptive terms in our language. It's a view about the nature of moral properties.
There were so many thoughts flying around based on what you said. What was the first argument you were sketching right before good is just, that's the property. It's just good. It's a natural property. That's right, about languages. You said this is a claim about languages. So it seems
right.
To
so
me
again, briefly, I can talk a little bit too much and give a complicated train of thought, which can not good for communicating. So let me try and summarize that in a short little soundbite. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that many people will try to define natural as a view about the expressive power of the descriptive terms in our language, whether or not they realize they're doing that, right? Because they'll say that the moral naturalism is the view that descriptive claims can refer to moral facts, right?
Right.
But if you take that proposal seriously and literally, what you're saying is that the expressive power of the descriptive terms in our language is such that they are capable of referring to moral properties. But what the expressive power of the descriptive terms of our language is a highly contingent matter about sort of how our language has evolved and what sorts of terms exist in our language and how we can deploy them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so my reaction to that is to say that I think that undersells what the what the proponent of this distinction would say is the real distinction here between naturalism and non-naturalism. Because your objection roughly seems to be, well, then whether or not a view counts as naturalist or non-naturalist will just be language relative to the the mechanics and the workings of the language that has actually evolved and is used, and that's contingent. However, I think what the proponent of this distinction would say is that no, the non-naturalist isn't just saying that descriptive terms do not in fact pick out moral terms. Rather, truly descriptive terminology cannot pick out evaluative or moral claims. That if these terms are really descriptive, they can never be about moral claims, no matter the language dynamics or syntax or meaning that evolve. And so it wouldn't be language relative, it wouldn't be contingent. Rather, it's a fact that descriptive claims, whatever we might mean by that, but descriptive claims, even in this new language, if they really are descriptive, then they cannot pick out moral claims. Rather than making a claim about what is the case, they're saying about what could be the case.
Sure. So this gets into a question of so how do we define the difference between a descriptive term and a normative or evaluative term, right? Mm-hmm. We could sort of brute force that, right, and say that we define descriptive terms as any terms that don't refer to moral properties.
Well, that wouldn't be helpful here.
Yeah, right, but that wouldn't be helpful, right? If you don't want to go for the brute force method, then you're going to have to come up with an independent characterization of descriptive terms and then give a substantive argument for the claim that you just made that descriptive terms couldn't possibly refer to moral properties. And it's not clear what such an argument would look like. I mean, people have tried, but that's very fraught. But, even I want to sort of get away from that way of doing things because, again, this is a way of engaging in a debate about whether or not two-term naturalism can be made to work, right? Mm. But the other point that I made, which is a more fundamental point, is that whether or not there are terms of a certain kind that refer to moral properties is not to the point, right? The one-term naturalist is going to say that there is one and only one property, one and only one term that refers to the property of goodness, and that term is good.
Right.
Right. And so, that's entirely consistent with naturalism, right? Because there's one and only one property that refers to goodness. That term is good, and good is a natural property, right? That's a naturalistic view. What I just said there is a naturalistic view. So any view that tries to push back against naturalism by focusing on this distinction between descriptive and normative terminology is going to be systematically missing the point.
I wonder, though, what does that view mean on a naturalist account? You can stipulate whatever you'd like, I suppose, and then adopt a label for your view and say, that's my view that asserts, claims X, Y, and Z, and package them together. But that doesn't mean they fit together well. Okay, there is goodness, and the one term that can successfully refer to it is good. And then I suppose you could just say, and my view is goodness is a natural property. But if you don't say anything else, or if that's all you can say, I don't understand how this view is going to distinguish itself from staple non-naturalist views like Michael Hume or Eric Wielenberg or whomever else. What makes it a natural property? If it's not reducible to other things, I can understand what you mean when you say, okay, goodness is reducible to these other, more mundane descriptive claims. But if you eschew that and you just kind of assert this is a natural thing, then it may be that what distinguishes us is just purely semantic. We agree on the underlying ontology about morality. Some people want to call it natural, some people want to call it non-natural, but that's a purely verbal dispute. That would be what I would say at that level.
Well, I certainly agree that there's a lot of potential for verbal confusion here, and indeed plenty of actual verbal confusion here.
Right.
The literature is a mess. That said, when you talk about this distinction within metaethics, this is widely viewed as being a metaphysical distinction rather than a linguistic distinction. It is in some ways the main sort of premier distinction within realist metaethics. It's considered to be a metaphysical debate, right? Moral facts exist, but what kind of facts are they? Are they natural facts or are they not? So metaphysics is hard and metaphysics is weird. And so a way that people have tried to like kind of work their way around the metaphysical debate is by turning it into a debate about language, but then you're changing the topic, right? So I mean, you could do that, right? And you could just try to say, oh, well, so it's a debate about language, and then people are kind of, fighting each other over sort of, using terms in different ways, and then it all just falls apart. You could. But let's try to make it a metaphysical debate, right? Let's try to give some sense to the idea that this is a metaphysical debate. It is the main metaphysical debate within metaethics. So then that just gives rise to this question of what a natural property is at all. And this is controversial. So I'll give two different characterizations of a natural property. One characterization of a natural property is that it's a property that we can know about by using scientific methods. Now that is the standard way in which natural properties tend to be defined within philosophy more generally. So it's saying that we can know about goodness by using broadly scientific methods. Now, my problem with that characterization is that it seems to, again, change the topic. Not from metaphysics to language, but from metaphysics to epistemology, right? Because it's a question about how we can know about moral properties, not about the nature of moral properties. So my preferred characterization is to say that properties are natural, and thus moral properties are natural properties, if they have causal powers. And in particular, the power to have a causal impact on, to make a difference with respect to the course of our sense experiences. That, I think, is a purely sort of metaphysical idea, right? It's talking about the nature of the properties themselves, the intrinsic powers that they have, in relation to our sense experiences, of course. And then that connection with the sense experiences then explains why people have found the connection to science to be a sensible way of making sense of this idea of naturalness, right? Because I think it's plausible that we can know about a property by broadly scientific methods if and only if it's the kind of property that has causal powers of a kind that can make a difference as to the course of our sense experiences. So that's what I would say is a natural fact. And so then the moral naturalist view would be the view that moral properties are natural properties, which is to say that they have causal powers, and in particular causal powers of a kind that would allow us that would make a difference as to the course of our sense experiences, and thus that we could be able to study moral facts by using broadly empirical methods.
And would that way of defining natural, would that then still qualify the non-naturalists I've referenced as non-naturalists? Like, I don't know Michael Huemer's view well enough to give the answer to this, but like, would Michael Huemer then say, okay, I would still then qualify as a non-naturalist because I don't think moral properties have this causal power? Or whatever non-naturalist you might want to reference.
I think that it's going to be a little bit complicated if you sort of go down the list of non-naturalists, because different non-naturalists will define their non-naturalism in different ways, and maybe they don't make explicit statements about the very thing that I just said right there. Right. But I think that way of doing thing would capture all or almost all naturalists or non-naturalists, put them on the right side of that divide.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that Huemer and Enoch themselves would count as non-naturalists according to that way of carving things up. Okay. Well, we've gotten pretty technical, but it's interesting to me. But I do think viewers would be upset if I didn't ask you about the more fundamental
and I think a provocative claim of error theory, which is that moral discourse is ostensibly about objective facts, but there are no objective facts here to speak of concerning morality, and so all of our moral discourse, it's just false. It's an error. Why think that? Why think there are no objective moral facts?
So one thing that I like to start out with saying here is that when you're talking about other kinds of anti-realism, like non-cognitivism or subjectivism, as we discussed earlier, the major objections to non-cognitivism and subjectivism is that they end up with weird theories of language that can't explain some sort of very straightforward and intuitive features of our language, about how we can use moral language in logical contexts, and about how we can use how we can disagree with one another using moral language. The other anti-realists, other than error theorists, have huge problems with their theory of language, theories of thought and language. So what the error theorist does to start out with is they agree with the realists about theories of moral thought and language. We're talking about objective moral facts. But then the biggest problem for realists of various kinds is how can you make sense of that, right? What are moral properties even supposed to be? How can we know about them? They're a strange and different kind of property that we need to be able to know about by using strange and different kinds of methods. It's really hard to figure out how to pair moral realism with a broadly scientific sort of contemporary naturalistic worldview. And so the realists, they've got it easy on the language. They've got to struggle really hard on the metaphysics and epistemology. Whereas the other anti-realists, right, they got it really easy on the metaphysics and epistemology. Yeah, it's just social conventions and what I happen to believe and the attitudes that I have, right? So what error theory is, fundamentally, it is a conjunction of the most plausible realist claims, and the most plausible realist claims are the realist claims regarding language and thought, with the most plausible anti-realist claims, which are the anti-realist claims about metaphysics and epistemology. So it is a conjunction of two extremely plausible theses. And the error theorist simply denies the least plausible thesis of the other anti-realists having to do with thought and language, and the least plausible thesis of the realists having to do with their metaphysics and epistemology.
Right, but so then what are these problems for a realist view, the metaphysics and the epistemology? Like if you had to cash that out, what's the bird's eye view of this complicated issue? But what are the primary problems there?
Right. So I mean, the primary problems there. So let's talk epistemology first. How do we know about moral claims? We can talk about this in terms of the naturalist, non-naturalist distinction, right? The naturalist says we know about them through broadly scientific methods. That's insane, right? Like, what experiment could we run to figure out, whether or not abortion is morally wrong, right? I give you unlimited budget, unlimited staff, right? Figure out whether or not abortion is morally wrong.
Right.
Right. Give you the biggest lab that you want. Where do you start? Where do you start? By studying human embryology? We know plenty about human embryology. That doesn't help. Right? By studying the nature of wrongness itself? That doesn't help either. I mean, we could do an anthropological study to try to show the kinds of things that we generally consider to be good or bad, right or wrong. And most naturalist views kind of end up heading in that direction, where they're like, oh, it's just a sort of anthropological fact about social structures. But learning about the anthropological facts about social structures doesn't seem like the kind of thing that can generate that's actual moral knowledge, right? We learn what society believes, but we don't want to know what society does believe. We want to know what they should believe, right? Learning these anthropological facts just seems like you're learning the wrong kinds of facts. So science is going to help. Doesn't help. So you need to go with some other kind of methodology, an intuitionist methodology, maybe, right? But intuitionism is also insane, right? It's just like, think about it and you figure it out. Think about it, then you know. That doesn't make sense, right? How can simply reflecting on the concept of morality tell us one way or the other about whether or not abortion is morally wrong, or anything like that? It's the epistemology is just a mess, and everyone kind of assumes it has to work, because if it doesn't work, we're going to be moral skeptics, and we don't want to be moral skeptics, so it's got to work some way. Well, no, I'm a moral skeptic. I just don't, we've been trying really hard to come up with a non-deranged moral epistemology for 3,000 years now, and we haven't come up with anything.
I have several thoughts about these epistemological objections, which I think are interesting, but my sympathies are with the ethical intuitionist camp. If you had to pin me down on what my moral metaethics are, what my epistemology would be, it's this intuitionistic line. Although I haven't looked into it in great depth, so I may not be able to refute you. It seems to me that what intuitionists are asserting isn't insane or bizarre, and is actually quite plausible, specifically in the case. So, as I understand it, an intuition in general is just the way something seems. It's a seeming. And so you might talk about perceptual seemings. It seems to me that there's a camera in front of me about a foot away from my face. You might talk about intellectual seemings when I contemplate the laws of logic or truths of mathematics, like what seems to be the case about these things. And then we could talk about moral or ethical seemings, what seems to be the case about moral realities. Torture seems evil and wrong in most circumstances. And it's on that basis that we infer or believe in moral facts. It seems to be the case, and I've got no strong reasons to think I'm delusional about what seems to be the case, and so I accept it. And then that seems roughly plausible for perceptual seemings and how we know an external world exists, or we know certain objects in that world exist. It's because it seems like they do, and so I accept it, all things being equal. And I think mathematical and logical truths provide the most apt comparison here for what we think about ethical intuitions. How do I know that 2 + 2 = 4? Well, I think through the way you labeled as crazy. I contemplate the concepts of 2 plus, I guess not 2 twice, but 2 plus equals and 4, and I see that 2 + 2 = 4. I think descriptively that's how I do it, and I think that's the only way you can do it. It is just this conceptual reflection upon what seems to be the case as I contemplate the concepts of 2 and 4. And that's how I know it. I don't think you're going to get any other way of coming at these truths, which is both accurate of how I do it and or even how I could do it. And so if that's right, I think you could say broadly the same thing about evaluative properties, what ought to be the case, what is the case. What ought to be the case, what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. I contemplate these things, and they seem right and they seem good. They seem wrong, they seem evil, and that's why I accept it. That epistemology doesn't strike me as crazy. It does if you leave it at the talk of intuition and you decide to, and then you don't define it any further, and it just kind of leaves you in this area or popular conception as an intuition of your gut instinct. But I don't think that's how intuitionists mean it. So I think cashed out in that way, it strikes me as quite plausible. But back to you, Matt.
Yeah, so obviously you're wrong about all of that.
Right.
So, this does get into some really, really deep in the weeds, epistemology and metaphilosophy concerns about how is philosophy even possible.
I totally agree with you. Yeah.
So I have answers to these questions, and I think that these questions are correct and are kind of common sense in a lot of ways, but they take a little bit of digging. Let me just give kind of the quick version of it, and then you can kind of poke at things that you might want to poke at.
Sure.
So when it comes to, so you talked about two different things. You talked about seemings of the external world, and then you talked about mathematical reflection.
Sure.
So when it comes to the external world, I will, of course, acknowledge that the way things seem to me perceptually is highly epistemically relevant. But I am, in general, what's known as an explanationist about how we can come to know about the external world. And the basic idea there is that we know that things are the way they are because they are the best explanation of our experiences. So, we both have experiences as of computer monitors right in front of us. And I do know that there's a computer monitor right in front of me. But the reason why I know that doesn't really have to do with, it's not just like I have a perceptual experience and that experience has a content, that there is a monitor in front of me, and then that provides justification all by itself, the fact that I have an experience with content. Well, because you can have lots of experiences with lots of content, and many of them are deranged. The full story of why these experiences give me knowledge of the external world is that there is a computer monitor in front of me is the best explanation of why I'm having that experience. The thing that transforms a perceptual experience into genuine justified belief and on into knowledge is the availability of an explanatory structure which explains why I have the experiences that I have, and where that sort of story about the explanatory structure includes the existence of a reality around myself. So I said I'd be quick. You can push back on that later if you want. So that's what I think is the case about the external world, and I don't think that is the case in the moral case, right? I can explain why I have my moral intuitions, my moral sensibilities, and so on and so forth, in a way that talks about socialization, that talks about moral psychology, that talks ultimately about evolution, but it isn't going to involve the fact of the matter about any particular moral fact. So I think that sort of analogy with perception breaks down because of the availability of an causal explanatory story in the external world case that doesn't exist in the moral case. Okay, so what about math then, right? Because math, we don't need to have that sort of causal explanatory story there. Math is different. Well, math is also very complicated. So how do we have mathematical knowledge? No one agrees about that. It's a really hard question. But my inclination when it comes to mathematical knowledge is to say that mathematical knowledge is all broadly conceptual knowledge. Now, there's a certain sort of like strong version of the conceptualist view, like a logicist view, which isn't going to work really. But just sort of like a broad sense of it's about the relationships between ideas. It's about understanding the relationships between ideas. It's a broadly Humean view, right? And so this is an argument that Hume makes in the treatise and in the Second Enquiry when he's talking about the possibility of moral knowledge. It says, how we have mathematical knowledge is we can reflect on the mathematical concepts, and we can understand by sort of reflecting on our concepts and comparing them to one another, that this is a relationship between those concepts, or a relationship between the ideas, is the way that he put it. And the way that he illustrates this is if you take two things together and another two things, and then you put them together, then you get four. And you can't imagine having two things and putting together and getting anything other than four. Right? Once you've imagined two things and then another two things, you have ipso facto imagined exactly four things. So that's just sort of a fact about how our concepts relate to one another. But he says the same is not true of moral reflection, right? If we imagine killing, we don't find the idea of wrongness in the idea of killing. You examine it in any particular way, and you're not going to find the idea of wrongness contained in the idea of killing. He says it's only once you turn your reflection inward to your own breast, to your own emotional reactions, that you can find the source of the idea of wrongness. So, again, okay, I'm going to try to keep it short. I won't get into all the details there. You can push back where you want. But that's the basic idea that I accept, right? That this sort of kind of basic. This is a human idea in both regards. When it comes to our empirical knowledge of the external world, that's reasoning based on relations of cause and effect and explanatory causal structures. And when it comes to a priori knowledge, that is knowledge of the relations of ideas that you can explain by reflection on our own ideas and seeing what our own ideas deductively entail. And if you've got any purported area of knowledge which is neither of those two things, cast it into the flames, for it's nothing but sophistry and illusions. And I think that morality belongs in the flames for that reason.
Let me make 2 quick points. So, just in the effort of furthering the dialectic, I don't actually have any firm views on this, but let's see if it holds water. The first point is that I have heard of this view that like our knowledge of the external world is grounded in an inference to the best explanation about, you know, the uniformity and stability of our sense experience. One issue with that, so the first point is that if this is right, that what justifies our belief in an external world is an inference to the best explanation, I think that would entail that the vast majority of people alive today and down through history have an unjustified belief in the external world. Because the vast majority of people do not believe that there is this world outside their minds of physical objects, of laptops and iPhones and coffee cups, as an inference to the best explanation of these various facets of their experience. Rather, I think they just infer it directly. Or they don't infer it, they just directly believe it because of the experience in the way that the intuitionist is claiming. Like, it seems to them that these things are the case, and so they accept it. So that would be my first point. And then the second point about logical and mathematical truths is, I think that's largely right. We observe certain relationships between the concepts involved, and it is the case that that's not how we do it in the moral case. But that just pushes the point back one step. How do you know that these relationships obtain between the concepts of 2 and 4 and plus? Well, because it seems like they do. It seems to be the case that they do, and that ultimately is what justifies you in affirming these mathematical claims. And so that's exactly what the ethical intuitionist is going to claim happens in the cases of ethical reflection. I see a child drowning, and it just seems like it would be objectively wrong not to help them. And so that is what justifies my belief in the objective moral properties of the situation. And right, it is the case, you're right, that doesn't involve this kind of conceptual relationship, but it does involve the same kind of reasoning that you ultimately are led back to in the case of moral and logical truths.
All right, so respond to both of those.
Sure.
So on the external world point, no, we do engage in inference to the best explanation. So I like the phrase inference to the best explanation because it gives an immediate sense of what exactly we're supposed to be talking about here. But I also don't like it because that slogan is apt to mislead in a variety of ways. And so one way in which it can mislead is that it creates the impression that we are engaging in a process of like conscious inference. And that is incorrect. Most of this inferring to the best explanation happens sort of automatically. But it builds on sort of underlying beliefs that we have about the underlying causal structure. So one way that I like to sort of think about this and explain this is think about like in the Matrix, right? Everyone's favorite external world epistemology piece of media / thought experiment. Neo's in the Matrix, right? And he has all the experiences that we have, and so believes that there's the sort of external world. Then he gets pulled out of the Matrix, right? and Morpheus tells him he's a battery and everything, and it's a whoa. Then he goes back in, right? And when he goes back into the Matrix, he has the exact same sense experiences that he did before he went into the Matrix. But the beliefs that he's forming automatically, not as a basis of any sort of conscious deliberation, are very different about the nature of the world he sees around him than he was forming before. And that's because he's got different background beliefs about the underlying causal structure of what's going on, right? He no longer thinks that that's air he's breathing. So the lesson of that is that what we believe on the basis of our experiences is partly determined by just the raw inputs of our experiences, but also largely determined by our sort of background beliefs about kind of what's going on and what is giving rise to our experiences. This happens even at the basic level of perception. What we experience, the content of the experiences themselves, is heavily determined by sort of just background expectations about what we're going to be experiencing. The raw data into our sense organs is highly indeterminate. The actual content of our experiences is mostly generated by our expectations about what we are going to experience, and the raw inputs from our sensory organs are mostly a corrective to those expectations. The experiences themselves are a product of those expectations, and those expectations are themselves the product of underlying causal modeling happening within our brains. So that's the more sort of developed view there. So yeah, it's not like a conscious, deliberative inference to the best explanation in the way that inference to the best explanation might suggest, but the consistency and solidity of our experiences is the sort of thing which creates a sort of background causal model in our minds of our experiences being caused by a world around us. And so it's that background causal model which is operant in us forming the beliefs that we have in direct response to our experiences. So that's what I say about the external world case, to get into a bit more detail. Now, to get into a bit more detail on the a priori case, I think it's basically the same. Only instead of surveying the physical world around us, we are instead trying to come to an understanding of the nature and broadly functional character of the concepts that we use to understand the world. And our concepts they do have a causal functional profile to them, right? If I say 2 + 2 = 4, that immediately makes you go, yes, of course. If I say 2 + 2 = fish, that immediately should make you go, what the fuck, right? Like complete failure, category error, or something like that, right? The fact that you have those two different reactions is a product of your concepts, of how the parts of your brain which encode those concepts, sort of how they fit together. And just as experimentally, we might try to figure out the way the world works by poking it in different sorts of ways and seeing how things react, we can thought experimentally, this is what a thought experiment is, sort of try to push our concepts together in different ways and see how they react. So I think that ultimately, while you're correct that there is just how things seem to us when we're doing conceptual reflection, the epistemic import of those seemings that come from conceptual reflection is not just the sort of Mike Humer phenomenal conservative story of it seems to me that P, therefore I am prima facie justified in believing that P. Rather, those seemings are understood through a implicit set of background knowledge about the underlying relations between our different concepts in this case. And when we are sort of doing philosophy, what we're doing is we're poking our concepts from different directions to try to sort of map out the functional network of our concepts. And to the extent that you're with me that it's not a conceptual truth, that once you think about killing, you automatically, that is to think of it as being wrong. That's not a conceptual truth in that way. That reveals a fact about just the impossibility of using that kind of a priori reflection to come up with moral knowledge, because we can get a priori moral knowledge through that kind of conceptual reflection only if our concepts line up in the right way, which in the moral case they don't. So that's the more detailed view on that side.
Okay, I'll give two brief responses. I'll let you reply, and then we'll wrap it up. So that first point about the matrix, I think the intuitionists can accommodate that just fine. I mean, their claim isn't that seemings are indubitable, that they are defeasible. They only give prima facie justification, and so they can be outweighed by other factors. And so Neo, upon waking up, well, he's got an immediate defeater for all of his seemings prior to that. And so when he goes back into the matrix, there are these defeating facts that are still present. He was outside the matrix. He saw other inconsistent physical realities. And so these seemings no longer provide that justification. Now, I think it's obviously true that we have like models of the world that we superimpose to make experiences intelligible. But I don't know that is inconsistent with what the intuitionist claims, because ultimately that model has to get constructed somehow, right? And I think that's just going to boil down fundamentally to the way things seem. And we begin pairing things together, and then our inferences get more complex over time. But I think ultimately, in order to judge whether or not the model is correct, we will have to just ask, well, what does the world seem like to me? And then does it cohere with that? And now ultimately, if that becomes circular, well, then I think you wouldn't have any sort of knowledge of the external world be possible. So there you go. That's off the top of my head to the first one. The second one about a priori knowledge and about these sort of conceptual relationships. Still, it seems to me that when I think about why 2 + 2 = 4, it really just is that I'm reflecting on the concepts of 2 plus and 4, and they just seem to fit together in that way. It seems like 2 added to itself equals 4. And you can build this, again, I think the same point remains, like you can build this out into a further conceptual apparatus, but like ultimately we're going to have to judge whether or not those foundational mathematical or logical principles are correct. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to look at them and we're going to say, do they seem right or not? And you can't go any further from that. So again, unless you want to, and so then we might say, okay, this is good. I will now take that on background, and then that will help me further refine reflections down the line. We want them all to fit together coherently, and that might involve trade-offs between what seems to be the case and what I've already taken on. But if you push all the way back to like what grounds the background assumptions, it either is something or it's nothing at all. And it seems like the only thing it can be is just this basic seeming. So there you go. Those are my two final points, and I'll leave the last word to you.
So like that's a very Michael Huemer line of argument that you're pressing right there.
Well, I've spoken to him, so I've just imbued it all. But go ahead.
Right, and he's a smart guy. I respect Michael Huemer, even though I disagree with him. I mean, so what my reaction to this line of argument is that it's a little bit too flattening in a way. Like, so there are issues in like developmental psychology having to do with like children developing object permanence. They don't get that immediately, right? Object permanence is something that you have to learn. There's a famous quote from William James when he says, like, for a newborn, their experiences of the world are a blooming and buzzing confusion, right? And we're only able to sort of make sense of those over time through the kind of cognitive development that comes from observing the world and trying to make sense of it.
Right.
So, that's to say that, well, yes, sure, ultimately it does depend on how things seem to us in a way. the way things seem to us is also ultimately a product of how we have causally modeled the world, right? This is how our minds are functionally organized. Our minds are functionally organized in order to, like, take all these different sorts of raw data into our experiences, right? The stimulation of the rods and cones in our retina, and try to organize that into a causal model. And then how things seem to us is not a product of our experiences. It is largely a product of that causal model, as is continually corrected by our experiences. So while sort of phenomenologically, like as we're our consciousness is skimming along on the top of this really complicated underlying mental model of the world, we are aware of how things seem to us and often reflectively endorsing how things seem to us. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, it's just about how things seem to us. But the nature of those seemings is itself, in an extremely deep and consequential way, the product of an underlying, continually developed causal mental model of the world. Right. So if you just want to say, well, in the end, it's all about, just seemings, you're missing the most important thing. And so I'll say exactly similar thing about the a priori case, because my account of a priori knowledge is structurally very similar to my account of a posteriori knowledge, which is that we have a more or less well-developed concept, sort of background conception of how our concepts fit together. And as we engage in reflection on our concepts, which we don't do nearly as often as we think about the world. I mean, philosophers do it more, but we're weird, right? As we try to engage in that reflective endeavor, we're kind of skimming along phenomenologically on the just the level of our conscious awareness. Oh, it's all seemings, but no, those seemings are, again, in a very profound sort of way, a deep product of our own reflective understanding of the functional relationships between our different concepts and the way that they give rise then to these different phenomenal characteristics. I respect seemings. They're important. They are what is phenomenologically present to us. But those seemings have epistemic import only insofar as they can be suitably integrated into an underlying causal and functional model. So that's epistemically what I'm going to urge there. And now I know you said you wanted to wrap things up, and we're over an hour and a half, but we've had technical difficulties here. I want to get to one last point, because we didn't really get into like the error theory of the error theory. So I want to do a little bit on that, right? So again, the way that I just motivated the error theory view is by saying that it's a combination of the realist's most convincing view, right, which is what they have to say about language, and the anti-realist's most convincing view, which is what they have to say about metaphysics and epistemology. But the weird thing is when you put those together, everybody hates the view, right? So, like 70% of philosophers are cognitivists, 70% of philosophers are worried about the metaphysics and epistemology of realism. So when you put those together, you'd expect 50% error theorists. It's like 2%, right? Everyone hates error theory for some reason. And I find myself confounded by that in some ways. Like, get over it, right? Like you take a plausible view and a plausible view and put them together, and you should end up with a pretty plausible view. I kind of don't understand why people don't like error theory. I mean, I do, because I talk to people and they tell me, right? They say, oh, this implies that it's not true that murder is wrong. Yes, it does imply that it's not true that murder is wrong. Isn't that insane? Well, no, I mean, I still hate murder, right? So although error theory is often talked about as being the same thing as nihilism, I don't like to use the word nihilism to talk about error theory, because it is not a nihilistic point of view. I still have my own moral commitments. that I feel very strongly and I care about very deeply. These are an important central part of who I am as a agent who acts in the world, right? I care about other people deeply. And, one thing that you learn in philosophy is that there's no rational basis for caring about other people deeply. The universe isn't telling you to care about other people deeply. That's just something that I do. I just do care about other people deeply. And then there's this idea that once I learned that the universe isn't telling me to care about other people deeply, that's just something that I do, then I ought to respond to that by stopping caring about other people. And that's insane, right? The universe isn't what tells me to care about other people. I care about other people. Right. For, maybe contingent reasons in some sense, because of evolution, socialization, whatever, right? Like, I'm aware of that, but that doesn't undercut any of the rational reason-giving force of my own moral commitments for myself. So I think the biggest reason why people don't want to be error theorists is because they feel like if they give up on the truth of moral propositions, they're not just giving up on the truth of moral propositions. They're giving up on something more. They're giving up on a vindication for their actions, or a vindication of their way of life, or a basis on which they might criticize other people for not failing to live up to their own standards. And I think it's extremely important to realize you're not giving up on any of those things. You're really not, right? You're just realizing that the basis that those kinds of actions have is not an endorsement by the universe of those kinds of actions in any way. It simply comes from your own personal moral commitments, which are deep and profound and central to who you are, and they are in fact the best way to justify and rationalize the actions that you're going to be taking, right? The indifference of the universe is not the indifference of the self or your family or your friends.
I think that's a good as note of any to end on. Matt Lutz, thank you for coming on the podcast today. You've left me with a lot to think about.
Pleasure.
I mean, I think the issues you pointed out about the conceptual apparatus that we bring to the seemings, that's an important point that I will need to assess if I want to maintain my intuitionistic leanings. So, if nothing else, thank you for that. And I think people will like this conversation. So thank you for coming on today.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.